June 6, 1944. Just after midnight, a young machine gunner named Hinrich Seau sat inside his bunker at Strongpoint WN62, overlooking Omaha Beach. Hours earlier, he had written to his girlfriend back in Metzingen, promising that the invasion, if it came, would be short-lived, that the Atlantic Wall would swallow the attackers before they even touched the sand. Rommel himself had visited days earlier, praising the fields of fire and telling his men that if the Allies dared to land here, this coast would become their grave. Inside the bunker, the night felt calm, almost peaceful, nothing like the storm that was about to arrive. Seau checked the barrel of his MG42, unaware that by midday it would be warped from heat, surrounded by more than 10,000 shell casings, and that he would be crying uncontrollably as he watched an invasion force so vast that his mind simply rejected what he was seeing. The German confidence had come from the Atlantic Wall itself, thousands of miles of concrete, steel, and fortification stretching from Norway to Spain. Propaganda called it unbreakable, and on paper it looked like it. Omaha alone bristled with bunkers, gun pits, anti-tank positions, mortars, rockets, mines, and thousands of obstacles waiting beneath the tide. German officers calculated that any landing attempt would be shredded before it reached dry sand. Their equations assumed one thing that would prove disastrously wrong: unlimited ammunition. On June 5th, the weather convinced almost every senior German officer that no invasion could possibly come. Winds were too strong, waves too high, and clouds too low. The Luftwaffe's meteorologists promised bad weather for 2 more weeks. Officers left their posts for meetings and celebrations. Even Rommel went back to Germany with a birthday present for his wife. No one knew the Allies had weather stations far across the Atlantic and aircraft flying where the Germans could not. They detected a brief break in the storm, just long enough for an invasion. When paratroopers began falling across Normandy shortly after midnight, German headquarters dismissed the reports as another Allied deception raid. The landings were scattered, confusing, and in some places dummies were dropped with firecrackers attached. German officers could not piece together what was real and what wasn't. Major Hans von Luck, one of the few who immediately grasped the meaning, begged to counterattack. Headquarters told him to wait. He later wrote that in that moment he knew Germany had already lost the day. Just after 5:30 in the morning, as the first light broke over the water, German observers looked out and saw something that no amount of training had prepared them for. From horizon to horizon, the entire channel seemed filled with ships, not dozens or hundreds, thousands. Battleships, cruisers, landing craft, transports and vessels of every shape stretching farther than the eye could see. It was, in sheer scale, the largest armada ever assembled. In the bunkers overlooking the water, hardened soldiers who had survived years of war felt something very close to terror. They had been told the Allies were weak, divided, and hesitant. Instead, the entire industrial world seemed to be floating toward them. A few minutes later, the naval bombardment began. The ground shook like an earthquake. Concrete bunkers built to withstand anything cracked under the force of shells the size of small cars. Men were buried alive, dug out and buried again. Even veterans of the Eastern Front had never experienced anything like it. In the middle of this chaos, the Luftwaffe attempted to respond, and failed. When the order went out for a full counterattack, a wing commander famously replied, "What entire force? I have 2 planes." Only a single German sortie reached the beaches that morning, a brief and pointless strafing run by 2 FW-192s that vanished as soon as Allied fighters appeared. At 6:30, the landing craft dropped their ramps. Seau opened fire. The MG-42 ripped through the first waves of Americans, and for a moment, the German defenders believed the wall might actually hold. But every time they cut down one wave, another arrived. Destroyed landing craft were replaced instantly. Every time a machine gun fell silent, naval guns smashed the position that had hit it. German defenders quickly realized that the sea was not full of soldiers. It was full of a bottomless supply of machines, ammunition, and reinforcements. By mid-morning, Seau and the others defending Omaha faced the same dawning realization spreading across the entire German front. The invasion was not a single strike to repel. It was an industrial process. The Allies were not attacking with a force, they were attacking with capacity. As the morning wore on, The German positions that survived the bombardment kept firing, but the reality became impossible to ignore. Ammunition that had been calculated to last for days ran low before noon. Artillery units were supposed to fire steadily and precisely. Instead, they emptied their ready stocks within hours. Roads that might have brought more ammunition were cut off by constant fighter-bomber attacks. Every attempt to move supplies or reinforcements turned into a slaughter. Meanwhile, the Allies unleashed firepower in amounts that seemed absurd to the German defenders. American destroyers raced dangerously close to shore, firing their guns point-blank at bunkers that had survived the opening barrage. A single destroyer often fired more shells in an hour than an entire German battery had available for the day. German gunners rationed their remaining rounds, firing only when a target seemed guaranteed. The Allies simply had no such limitations. Their ammunition appeared endless. The armoured reserve that Rommel had fought so hard to keep near the beaches, the only hope of smashing the landings before they expanded, never arrived in time. Delayed by confusion, conflicting orders, and Allied air attacks, the 21st Panzer Division finally moved in the late afternoon. By the time they reached the coast, gliders from Operation Mallard were already arriving with fresh British reinforcements. Seeing another airborne force dropping from the sky, the panzers retreated rather than risk being cut off. The moment for a decisive counterstroke had passed. All through that day, German troops encountered weapons they had never seen before. Modified tanks with rotating chains to clear mines, others that could throw bridges, plough obstacles, or shoot jets of flame. These funnies, as the Allies called them, made a mockery of the static defences. What the Germans had spent years building, the Allies dismantled in minutes with machines designed for exactly that purpose. Behind the beaches, chaos multiplied. Allied paratroopers, some scattered, some perfectly placed, created a sense of constant danger. Rumours spread through German lines about entire divisions behind them, even when only small groups were present. Units refused to move, terrified of ambush. In some cases, nervous German soldiers fired at shadows or at their own forces in the confusion. Every report that reached command contradicted another. No one knew where the front line even was. Communications collapsed. Telephone lines cut by bombers or resistance fighters stayed down. Radios were jammed or destroyed. Generals listened to static and guessed at the situation. Reports of breakthroughs arrived hours late. Units that needed orders received none. Others marched blindly into ambushes or airstrikes. What looked like organization on the map dissolved into isolated pockets of men fighting without direction. By nightfall, the truth was undeniable. The Atlantic Wall had not been breached in one place. It had been shattered across the entire front. The Luftwaffe was absent. The Kriegsmarine was powerless. The coastal divisions, many made up of older soldiers and foreign volunteers, had been ground down in a single day. The impregnable fortifications had not even lasted until sunset. German commanders sent grim summaries to the 7th Army, combat strength collapsing, artillery nearly gone. Positions overrun or abandoned, enemy advancing everywhere, reinforcements stuck on roads or simply missing. The beach that was supposed to be a death trap for the Allies had become a funnel delivering endless waves of fresh troops with no meaningful German response. And still, the landings continued through the night. More ships arrived, more troops disembarked, more tanks rolled ashore. The German defenders realized they were watching not just an attack, but the beginning of an invasion machine that would run continuously day and night until France collapsed. What had begun at dawn as a confident expectation of throwing the enemy back into the sea ended with a sobering realization: the sea was delivering something Germany had never faced before, an industrial army that could not be stopped by courage, fortifications, or even skill. Germany's defenders had fought as hard as men could fight, but what they faced was not a traditional army. It was a system built to overwhelm everything in front of it. By the second day of the invasion, what remained of the German defense could barely function. The Allies had created a permanent foothold, and every hour more men, tanks, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies poured ashore. For the Germans still fighting, the difference between their world and the Allied world became brutally clear. The Allies replenished everything immediately. The Germans replenished nothing at all. Units that tried to counterattack found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of exposure and destruction. Every road to the beachheads was patrolled from the sky. Columns that might have once maneuvered in safety were now hunted every minute of daylight. A battalion that moved even a few kilometers found itself ambushed from above. Tanks were destroyed on roadsides before they could fire a shot. Trucks burning on highways became common landmarks. Hans von Luck's Panzer Grenadiers, among the few forces with real combat experience, discovered this firsthand. When they attempted to push toward the sea, the night sky suddenly lit up with Allied illumination flares. Naval guns found them instantly, firing as if guided by spotlights. In his memoir, von Luck described the feeling of being targeted not by an enemy he could fight, but by a machine that saw everything. His troops were cut apart before reaching the enemy lines. Half his strength vanished in minutes. And while German units dissolved under pressure, the Allies grew stronger every hour. Specialized harbors, gigantic artificial ports built in secret, were already being assembled offshore. Mulberry harbors made it possible to unload thousands of tons of supplies even in bad weather. Watching them appear shocked German officers. They had never conceived of such a thing. Movement for the Germans became nearly impossible. Division after division tried to make its way toward Normandy, only to be slowed, delayed, or destroyed. Allied air power didn't just attack, it strangled movement itself. Roads were cratered so deeply that vehicles had to detour through fields where they stuck in the mud or became easy targets. Railway lines were cut, bridges collapsed, communications towers burned. What few units reached the front did so battered, exhausted, and missing half their equipment. The most infamous example was the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. Its journey from southern France to Normandy should have taken a few days. Instead, it took 17. Longer than entire campaigns had lasted earlier in the war. By the time they arrived, they had already lost a third of their vehicles and much of their combat power. They stepped onto the battlefield already defeated by Allied air and resistance sabotage. In contrast, the Allies moved with machine-like precision. Fully equipped divisions landed in perfect sequence. Supply dumps grew into miniature cities. Fuel, food, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts, everything the Germans lacked was stacked in organized rows that stretched across the beaches. Bulldozers worked non-stop. Engineers laid roads and runways faster than German forces could destroy them. The Allies fought like an army designed by engineers, not generals. By mid-June, German resistance began to break from exhaustion and despair as much as enemy fire. Units that had once fought with absolute confidence now hesitated, unsure whether any counterattack could succeed or whether any reinforcements would arrive. Troops who had fought bitter campaigns in Russia admitted they had never seen destruction like this. The sense of hopelessness spread faster than orders could contain it. Carrington fell on June 12th, connecting Utah and Omaha into a single continuous front. The German paratroopers defending it, tough, elite troops who prided themselves on never retreating, pulled back in disorder. Their commander admitted in his report that his men were psychologically broken. They had fought without support, attacked from every direction, and watched the enemy grow stronger with each passing hour. Even brief German successes proved meaningless. Michael Wittmann's famous tank attack at Villers-Bocage destroyed more British armour in minutes than most units managed in days. But the British replaced those tanks almost immediately, while the Germans struggled to replace even a single Tiger. Wittmann's own tank was destroyed weeks later. He became a symbol not of German strength but of the futility of individual heroism in an industrial war. And while German commanders searched for opportunities to regain control, the Allies continued expanding, tightening, and reinforcing their lines. German units were now fighting not just armies, but an entire logistical ecosystem that dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht had ever encountered. The war in Normandy had become a test of endurance, and only one side had the means to endure. As June turned into July, the German command structure in Normandy continued to fall apart under pressures no army could withstand. Messages from the front became shorter, more frantic, more hopeless. Ammunition was nearly gone everywhere. Units were holding positions with fewer men each day. Commanders wrote reports that sounded less like military updates and more like admissions of collapse. Even when orders came down from higher headquarters, They often arrived too late to matter. The situation on the ground changed faster than the Germans could react. Then came the turning point, Operation Cobra. The Americans unleashed a bombardment so massive that even veteran German officers described it as beyond anything human beings should experience. Thousands of bombers blanketed the front with explosives, smashing entire defensive sectors in minutes. Trenches disappeared, forests flattened, vehicles flipped from the shock waves. Survivors staggered out deaf, blinded, or in shock, no longer able to function as soldiers. A German commanding officer reported simply, "My division has ceased to exist." The few units that survived Cobra's opening barrage were immediately overwhelmed by American armor pouring through the gaps. German lines that had already been thin and stretched now shattered completely. Tanks ran out of fuel, infantry ran out of ammunition, some regiments surrendered en masse, others melted into the countryside. There was no organized retreat, only fragmentation. And then came the final disaster, the Falaise pocket. German forces, trapped in a shrinking corridor, tried desperately to escape. What they ran into was a nightmare. Endless Allied artillery, rocket-firing aircraft, and tanks blocking every exit. Roads were piled with wrecked vehicles. Horses lay dead beside overturned wagons. Columns tried to move at night only to be spotted by flares and cut apart. Soldiers described the area as hell on earth. Tens of thousands were killed or captured. Entire divisions vanished. By the time the pocket collapsed, the German army in Normandy was effectively destroyed. They had lost their armor, their artillery, their supplies, and their best remaining troops. The Allies suffered losses too, but those losses were replaced instantly. Fresh tanks and vehicles rolled off landing ships daily, fresh divisions rotated in while German units fought until nothing remained. The disparity was absolute. Numbers told the story brutally. In less than 3 months, Germany lost more than 300,000 men in Normandy, killed, wounded, or captured. They lost over 2,000 armored vehicles. They lost their remaining air force in the region. They lost the port of Cherbourg, their ability to maneuver, and their last realistic chance to stop the Allies from breaking out of the beachhead. The Americans and British simply kept landing more of everything. More guns, more trucks, more aircraft, more fuel, more ammunition. Senior German officers later admitted what they already knew by mid-July. The campaign had been hopeless from the start. They weren't fighting equal opponents. They were fighting nations that could produce more weapons in a single month than Germany could in a year. They were fighting armies that had mastered logistics, air control, engineering, and firepower on a level the Wehrmacht simply could not match. Even Rommel, the hero of North Africa and one of the most respected soldiers of the war, reached the same conclusion. In his final report before being wounded, he told Hitler bluntly that the situation was unsalvageable. The enemy's superiority in material was too overwhelming to fight. Germany no longer had the means to influence the outcome. It was a message not of tactical failure, but of strategic impossibility. By early August, what remained of the German army in Normandy had lost faith in everything they had been taught about warfare. They had believed in discipline, courage, and tactical brilliance, but none of those could matter in a battlefield dominated by industrial capacity. They had entered Normandy as soldiers. They left, if they survived, as men who had seen the future of war and understood that no amount of skill could defeat nations that could build victory faster than Germany could resist it. By the end of the Normandy campaign, German survivors understood that what they had faced was something far larger than an invading army. They had confronted the full weight of modern industrial warfare, something the Wehrmacht had never been designed to fight. Their courage, discipline, and training had mattered, but only in small, fleeting moments. The overall outcome had been decided long before the first landing craft touched the sand. For many of the young men who had defended the Atlantic Wall, the shock was personal and devastating. Hinrich Seau, who had begun D-Day confident that he would help throw the Allies back into the sea, ended the day surrounded by a mountain of empty shell casings, exhausted and terrified, watching endless waves of American troops advance as if nothing could stop them. In his memoir, he admitted that the sheer scale of what he saw broke something inside him. No amount of bravery could matter when faced with an enemy that could replace losses instantly. Other veterans reached similar conclusions. Friedrich von der Heydte, one of Germany's most respected paratrooper commanders, later wrote that Normandy shattered the old idea of heroic warfare. The Allies had not won through individual brilliance. They had won through overwhelming production, relentless logistics, and a system that turned war into a continuous flow of material. The Germans were fighting as warriors. The Allies were fighting as an industrial civilization. Time and again, German officers recalled how their best efforts simply dissolved in the face of Allied resources. A Tiger Ace could destroy a dozen tanks and still lose the battle because more tanks arrived within hours. A regiment could fight bravely for days and then disappear beneath a rain of bombs. Communications could be re-established, only to be cut again minutes later. Roads could be repaired, only to be cratered by another fighter bomber pass. It felt less like fighting a human opponent and more like fighting a force of nature. The psychological collapse reached the highest levels. By mid-July, Rommel himself admitted privately that the war was lost, not because his soldiers were weak, but because the enemy's industrial capacity was simply beyond imagining. America alone was producing tens of thousands of aircraft each year. Factories built tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Supply ships unloaded fuel and ammunition in amounts that made German logistics officers feel as if they were living in a different century. To the men who survived Normandy, one truth became clear. Modern war belonged to the nations that could build the most, transport the most, and sustain the most. The Allies were not strong because of individual soldiers. They were strong because their economies functioned like an unstoppable engine. German soldiers learned that day that bravery and tactical skill could no longer decide wars. Only production could. Normandy taught them that the Third Reich had misjudged its enemies entirely. They had believed democracy was soft. They had believed mixed armies of different nations would falter. They had believed industrial societies were too fragile to fight a long war. But on June 6, 1944, they saw all those ideas crushed under the weight of a coordinated, mechanized, mathematically overwhelming invasion. The German defenders entered D-Day as believers in the superiority of their system. They left Normandy, those who survived, knowing their system had no future. They had been overtaken by a world of mass industry, endless logistics, and coordinated firepower. Their defeat was not only military but ideological. They realized that the world had shifted, and the power they once believed unbeatable was now obsolete. In the end, the story of the German experience in Normandy is the story of a massive awakening. It was the moment when soldiers raised on the myth of invincibility faced the reality of a war that had outgrown them. They learned that courage could not stop factories, that skill could not outmaneuver supply lines, and that determination could not overcome an enemy whose resources were practically infinite. They fought until their weapons overheated, their ammunition ran out, their positions collapsed, and still the Allied forces advanced as if untouched. In trying to stop the invasion, the German army had tried to stop a tide made of steel, fuel, ships, and machines, and like any tide, it swept forward relentlessly. Normandy taught them the final brutal lesson of modern war: industrial power, not ideology, not heroism, not even tactical brilliance, determines victory. Germany had entered the battle with the mindset of an older age. The Allies had arrived with the future, and the future won.